Microcultures are certainly a key part of thinking through the whole group dynamic, both the concept of tribes or how we belong. Microcultures are a key part of understanding just how groups work, thinking through how not only do ideals and values and ultimately behaviors define a broader group, i.e., a country, etc., but what about the subgroups? And I'd argue that the subgroups or this microculture piece is probably even more relevant to our role and world in marketing. We're going to learn about several things in this chapter. We're going to talk just about what a microculture is, talk about some of the microcultural groups that academicians have defined. We're going to think it through from the standpoint not only of the U.S. but outside. We'll perform a demographic analysis, or at least help understand how that works, and then identify some trends. So, as we know, culture really is a universal phenomenon, right? But the reality is that individuals may belong to many different cultural groups at once, and these groups can fluctuate. It tends to be hierarchical, and that's relevant, but also there tends to be smaller cultural groups that are linked to one another, and that's this idea of a subculture. We have your textbook gives you a hierarchy here that I think is pretty relevant. Let's say you looked at it from the standpoint of the U.S. and you'd have that as our national culture at top. Then you might have regional influences, your ethnic background's influence, the group within the world in which you live, and that may be related as much to neighborhood, income, part of the country, age, etc. There's lots of roles and expectations that microcultures impose on us, and I think if you think about that, I'm sure that it's pretty obvious, right? And more importantly, there sometimes can be conflicts. So there could be a situation where you have a couple different cultural expectations, and I think a pretty one that's talked about a lot would be for a young person who's an immigrant, right? I mean, they have parents that have one set of expectations, maybe their church has another set of expectations, and yet now they're part of this American society and even this subgroup of a particular age demographic which can pull at them. There can be lots of divergence, right? Where, you have to choose which group is going to have precedence in your life and in your mode of influence. So we talk about what are some of the broader microcultures within the region of the U.S. There was a book called The 9 Nations of North America that was published a while ago, but I think it's still incredibly relevant. And basically what they did was they said, it's not just the 50 states, but rather these 9 different areas that are relevant to how people think about food, how they think about the way they dress, their level of formality, and if you can see on this map, there's some hints to what that might be. It's pretty important because if you're going to market a product in our country, you need to kind of think through not only what that means in terms of its product attributes or its brand attributes, but how is that going to be related and received by the folks in the group in which you're speaking to. There's also lots of relevance here with sex roles in microculture, right? So what about expectations that people have within the group? We have to be aware of that, not only because of the way our products will fit in their life, but the way we talk to them about it. We need to be relevant and need to feel as though we want our audiences to believe and just to really see that we understand them. Marketing communications really does a careful job of trying to figure this all out. Age-based microcultures are interesting a lot of times for students to study because you're starting to become really aware of your generation when you go to college and to think through what that might mean for you and those around you. Lots of different similarities and ways that brands can even be consumed. So there's a thought here in terms of teens, right? What teens tend to do, how that relates to the brand, and then what that might be in terms of the output of that for some broader cultural ideas. We talk about these 4 a lot. The greatest generation, probably for you it's your grandparents' age. These are folks that came after the war. Baby boomers, which were really the children of the greatest generation. They were, and again in your textbook it'll have the exact years, but they are folks that are in their 50s and 60s, probably your parents. You have Gen X, which is 30s into your early 40s, and then millennials, which tends to be your group. The other piece that's relevant here, though, becomes what religious microcultures affect things, right? It affects a lot because it affects our daily life. It can affect the clothing choices we do. It can affect how we, spend our money and how we consume our free time. So we talk here about different religious percentages and how that ultimately will relate to brand preferences. Additionally, we have ethnic microcultures that we discussed already. We have a Hispanic culture, which has become huge in this country, along with African American culture and Asian culture. And then how does that relate to Caucasians? And this chart, and this is a little bit old now, 80% of the U.S. was white. Well, that's really moving to now where it's a greater percent that's Asian and a greater percent that's Hispanic. We also talk about things like social class, your income level, what practices you have in terms of social influences, what kind of stratification is relevant, and status symbols. These are sort of some of the social classes we tend to talk about in this country, all the way from upper class, which again tends to be more income and neighborhood based, down to the more working class cultures. In addition, though, we have sort of the everyday cultural influences, things that really do influence how we think about ourselves and the world around us, whether it's through activities we do like sports, our interest in music, gaming, virtual worlds, and even the goth culture. The thing we need to understand, though, is that microcultures really are not just American, right? And I'm guessing you know that, but they exist all over the world, and many times you'll find the microcultures can go across the world, so there's not that much of a difference between a hipster in the US and a hipster in France, right? There's this idea of what values resonate with that particular subcultural group. Now, demographics is something you need to kind of understand as you think through not only target audience development, but culture. And demographics are really the tangible human characteristics that define people. So your age, the income your family makes, where you live, they are tangible. Geodemographics just help us link that to geography, and there's some specific tools out there that do that more precisely. And then ultimately we'll often do demographic analysis, which is where we'll really profile groups based on where they live. The U.S. Census Bureau can be a great place to help. But the other thing you need to think through is just what cultural trends affect demographics, right? So there's things like declining birth rates, and what about consumers' influence in general, life expectancy, or even cultural diversity. Kind of an interesting side note, I know I did a little study a few years ago for Bethel, and we talked about this idea of declining birth rates and how it's not only impacted, baby products, but as these people grow up, it can really impact college attendance, right? So the tri-state area in the Midwest has a lower number of high school graduates each year, so that has implications for Bethel, right? I mean, Bethel needs to think through what does that mean for us as it relates to potentially reaching new audiences. So ultimately, you can see this on a broader level with birth rates and what this might mean. At the end of the day, what I want you guys to really think through is what groups do you belong to? What groups do the brands and or the marketing opportunities that you might work on belong to, and how does that impact how audiences are spoken to? And then for this particular project I'm asking you to do, you get to pick a subculture. Pick a group, one you're not in, study them, watch them, talk to them, look at secondary resources, so that ultimately you can be more informed of how you would market to them. Thank you for your attention.